Hello, my sleepy heads. It's good to have you back. Tonight, we'll journey far beyond the modern world to a civilization that exists somewhere between myth and history. A land said to rise from the ocean, where cities gleamed, harbors teemed with ships, and human ambition reached both technological and ethical heights. This is the story of Atlantis, a civilization of innovation, trade, and philosophical insight, whose legacy continues to captivate imagination. But before we begin, I want to thank you for being here. If these quiet journeys through time bring you peace, or help you drift into rest, please consider liking this video and subscribing. Now, settle in, close your eyes if you'd like, and let's return to the lost world of Atlantis. The origins of the Atlantis narrative are firmly rooted in the philosophical writings of Plato, the Greek thinker of the 4th century BCE. In the dialogues Timaeus and Critias, he presents Atlantis as a powerful maritime civilization situated beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a geographic reference corresponding to the Strait of Gibraltar. According to Plato, this society had achieved extraordinary technological and social sophistication, and yet it ultimately succumbed to moral decline, leading to its destruction in a single cataclysmic event. While the text presents these events in a narrative form, the primary function of the Atlantis account appears to have been pedagogical. Plato frequently used allegorical and hypothetical examples to illustrate philosophical principles, and Atlantis operates as a contrast to the idealized city-state he describes elsewhere. In this context, it served to examine the consequences of hubris, the responsibilities of rulers, and the dangers of unchecked power. The dialogue frames Atlantis not merely as a historical curiosity, but as a didactic tool, inviting readers to consider how ethical governance and civic virtue are maintained within societies. Plato's dialogues were written during a period of significant intellectual development in classical Athens, a city recovering from the Peloponnesian War and actively debating models of governance, justice, and human behavior. Philosophers, historians, and political theorists of the time were deeply concerned with defining the relationship between morality, law, and civic order. Within this environment, Plato's presentation of Atlantis can be seen as an extension of his wider philosophical project, using narrative and historical-style description to anchor his moral arguments. The account includes precise geographic references, descriptions of political institutions, and technical details regarding urban planning, agriculture, and naval capabilities. These elements lend the story a veneer of historical plausibility, which may have been intended to heighten the persuasive effect of the moral lessons embedded in the text. By situating Atlantis in a specific location and giving it a structured social and technological framework, Plato engaged his audience in critical consideration of the factors that produce societal success or failure. In addition to the philosophical context, the Atlantis narrative reflects broader cultural and intellectual currents in the ancient Mediterranean world. Oral and written traditions concerning distant islands, sunken lands, and catastrophic floods were widespread, influencing both Greek and Egyptian mythologies. Plato references Egyptian sources as part of the story, suggesting that the knowledge of Atlantis might have been preserved in records or oral accounts outside of Greece. Although modern historians consider these references as part of Plato's literary construction, they highlight the ancient practice of situating philosophical lessons within a historically resonant framework. Ancient audiences would have understood that blending fact, legend, and philosophical argumentation was a common method of instruction. Consequently, Atlantis was framed as a plausible, tangible civilization, even if its primary function was to demonstrate broader truths about human society. The text itself provides detailed descriptions of the political organization of Atlantis. Plato notes that the island was divided into 10 regions, each ruled by a king descended from a central lineage. These kings were responsible for administering justice, enforcing laws, and maintaining harmony among their territories. The society also exhibited advanced engineering, including extensive canal networks, bridges, and harbors, which enabled efficient trade and communication across the island. Plato emphasizes the use of a system of concentric rings, alternating between land and water, as a means of urban and agricultural planning. While no archaeological evidence has confirmed such a layout, the inclusion of these details illustrates Plato's effort to create a convincing, functional civilization for his philosophical exploration. The narrative demonstrates how political structure, resource management, and technological organization can interact to produce a highly ordered society, and how the failure of ethical governance can precipitate societal collapse. A central aspect of the Atlantis narrative is its moral dimension. Plato describes the gradual corruption of Atlantean society, noting that as wealth and power accumulated, the citizens increasingly ignored the principles of justice and moderation that had initially guided their civilization. This ethical decline, according to the text, directly led to Atlantis's eventual destruction, a dramatic consequence that reinforces the pedagogical aim of the story. In classical Greek thought, the intertwining of moral and civic virtue was a fundamental principle. The stability of a state depended on the character of its citizens and rulers. Plato's depiction of Atlantis exemplifies this linkage, illustrating in narrative form the potential consequences of moral failure on a societal scale. The story thereby serves as a cautionary model, inviting reflection on historical, political, and ethical questions rather than presenting a strictly historical record. Over the subsequent centuries, the Atlantis narrative sparked considerable debate among ancient scholars regarding its status as history or allegory. Some early commentators treated the account as factual, seeking corroboration through Egyptian or Phoenician records, while others emphasized its philosophical nature. The blend of geographic specificity, technical detail, and moral framework enabled multiple interpretations, allowing the story to function simultaneously as a literary work, a thought experiment, and a proto-historical account. This ambiguity contributed to its enduring relevance, as readers were encouraged to examine the broader implications of societal success, technological achievement, and ethical governance. By offering both plausibility and allegorical content, Plato ensured that Atlantis could remain a focal point for inquiry long after the dialogues were composed. From a modern perspective, the importance of Plato's Atlantis lies not in its physical reality, but in the methodological example it provides for studying the transmission of knowledge, cultural memory, and the integration of narrative with moral reasoning. The detailed descriptions of urban planning, engineering, and political administration demonstrate an awareness of the organizational challenges facing complex societies. Furthermore, the narrative anticipates the types of questions that modern historians and archaeologists would later explore: how civilizations emerge, flourish, and decline, how geographic and environmental conditions shape human settlement, and how ethical frameworks influence social cohesion. By constructing a detailed and internally consistent account, Plato created a model that invites comparative analysis, bridging literary, philosophical, and proto-historical domains. In conclusion, the first appearance of Atlantis in Plato's works established the foundation for a narrative that would endure for millennia. By embedding the story within a framework of philosophical inquiry, geographic reference, and technical detail, Plato ensured that Atlantis could be interpreted in multiple ways: as a moral lesson, a reflection on civic and political organization, and as a compelling example of human achievement and failure. This multifaceted nature laid the groundwork for later reinterpretations by Hellenistic, Roman, medieval, and modern scholars, who would grapple with questions about historical plausibility, cultural memory, and the interaction between fact and allegory. The clarity and rigor of Plato's account provide a baseline from which all subsequent discussions of Atlantis emerge, making it the essential starting point for any systematic exploration of the legend. Over the next centuries, as Mediterranean knowledge expanded and classical texts were transmitted across cultures, the Atlantis narrative would be reframed and reinterpreted, bridging literature, philosophy, and nascent historical inquiry in ways that continue to inform scholarship today. The ancient Mediterranean world possessed a complex and evolving understanding of geography, shaped by centuries of seafaring, trade, and interaction among diverse cultures. Long before the development of accurate maps or the tools of modern navigation, societies such as the Egyptians, Phoenicians, and Greeks relied on observation, oral reports, and conceptual frameworks to interpret their surroundings. Their understanding of distant lands was a combination of empirical knowledge, mythic imagination, and the logical extension of known territories into unknown regions. It is within this intellectual and cultural context that Plato situated the narrative of Atlantis, framing it in a manner that would be comprehensible and compelling to contemporary audiences. The notion of an island beyond the Pillars of Hercules reflected both a geographic reference and a symbolic boundary, demarcating the known world from the unexplored Atlantic. Classical Greek conceptions of geography were informed by practical experience and inherited knowledge. The Greek term geographia originally encompassed both descriptive accounts of the earth and the moral or political implications of space. Merchants, sailors, and explorers routinely documented coastal routes, currents, and harbors, creating a body of practical knowledge that could be disseminated through written and oral channels. Simultaneously, cosmological and mythic accounts, including tales of Hyperborea, the Hesperides, and other distant lands, influenced intellectual perception, blending factual observation with imaginative projection. These traditions were often codified in early maps and paraploi, which served as both navigational guides and representations of the world's structure according to contemporary understanding. By situating Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, Plato was employing an established conceptual framework that his audience would recognize as marking the edge of the familiar maritime world. Egyptian civilization contributed significantly to these perceptions, particularly through its records of distant lands and its extensive maritime trade networks. Plato's dialogues suggest that Egyptian priests preserved knowledge of Atlantis, a claim that, whether factual or literary, reflects the Greek recognition of Egypt as a repository of ancient wisdom. Archaeological evidence confirms that Egyptians engaged in long-distance expeditions to the Levant, Nubia, and Punt, demonstrating their capacity for organized, long-range maritime activity. These expeditions, combined with Egyptian traditions of recording historical and geographical knowledge, could have supplied the Greeks with accounts of distant, possibly legendary, islands. Even if Plato's reference was literary, it drew upon a context in which distant lands were not merely speculative, but had tangible economic and political significance in the Mediterranean world. The inclusion of Atlantis in this intellectual landscape also reflects the Mediterranean tendency to blend empirical observation with myth. Greeks were accustomed to integrating ethnographic and geographic information with stories of divine intervention, moral lessons, or historical events. By framing Atlantis as a technologically advanced society that existed beyond familiar boundaries, Plato connected a moral narrative with an intelligible, if speculative, spatial framework. This approach allowed him to communicate complex philosophical ideas while situating the narrative within a recognizable cosmography. The combination of geographic plausibility and mythic resonance strengthened the pedagogical impact, demonstrating how ethical, political, and societal concepts could be illustrated through an imagined, yet contextually grounded, civilization. Seafaring and trade also shaped perceptions of distant lands. The Aegean, Eastern Mediterranean, and Western Anatolian coasts had been extensively navigated since the early Bronze Age. Mariners recorded currents, winds, and coastal features, often noting islands and trading posts along the way. Such practical knowledge contributed to a cognitive map of the region that was surprisingly accurate for its time. When these observations were transmitted through written accounts, they became interwoven with tales of remote islands, sunken lands, or powerful foreign civilizations. Atlantis, positioned beyond the Pillars of Hercules, fits seamlessly into this tradition. It was a distant, inaccessible place that could plausibly exist while remaining removed from direct experience, allowing for narrative flexibility and moral abstraction. The conceptual framing of Atlantis also reflects broader Mediterranean attitudes toward the unknown. The ocean beyond the Strait of Gibraltar was both feared and admired. Classical authors described it as turbulent, vast, and largely unexplored, lending plausibility to stories of lands that had disappeared or remained hidden from human knowledge. By placing Atlantis in this region, Plato utilized the natural uncertainty and psychological impact of the unknown providing an environment in which moral and political lessons could unfold without contradiction from contemporary geographic experience. This strategic placement enabled readers to consider the consequences of power and corruption without invoking directly observable events, maintaining the allegorical utility of the narrative. Furthermore, the broader context of mythic geography in the ancient world illuminates why Atlantis was compelling to Plato's audience. Stories of the Hyperboreans, the Isles of the Blessed, and the Tartessians describe societies that were geographically remote, yet socially and technologically sophisticated. These narratives were not intended to convey strict empirical truth, but to offer models for reflection on human behavior, governance, and interaction with the environment. Plato's use of Atlantis aligns with this tradition, combining the familiarity of established geographic knowledge with imaginative projection. The narrative reinforces principles of political philosophy by situating the ethical experiment of Atlantis in a spatially and conceptually convincing context. Archaeological research and historical analysis suggest that the integration of geography, myth, and political philosophy was a common method of instruction. By embedding hypothetical societies within the framework of known and semi-known regions, educators could explore the dynamics of social organization, resource management, and technological innovation. In the case of Atlantis, the location beyond the Pillars of Hercules allowed Plato to examine societal evolution, the interaction between technological capacity and moral responsibility, and the consequences of environmental and political mismanagement, all while maintaining narrative plausibility. The enduring value of this approach is evident in how subsequent generations interpreted the narrative. Hellenistic scholars, Roman geographers, and later medieval thinkers all engaged with the concept of Atlantis within the framework of their own geographic and cosmological understanding. The blending of empirical observation and imaginative projection permitted the story to retain relevance even as knowledge of the Atlantic Ocean gradually expanded. Each reinterpretation relied on the same foundational logic. A distant, powerful society could serve as a mirror for reflection, its location credible, yet sufficiently remote to avoid empirical contradiction. In summary, the geographic imagination of the ancient Mediterranean established the necessary conditions for Atlantis to function as a compelling narrative. By drawing on Greek, Egyptian, and broader regional knowledge of distant lands, Plato positioned Atlantis in a plausible, yet speculative space that reinforced the philosophical aims of his dialogue. This placement exemplified the integration of empirical knowledge with imaginative interpretation, allowing audiences to engage with moral and political lessons within a framework that felt credible. The narrative demonstrates how ancient societies conceptualized their world, extending practical geographic observation into imaginative spaces for instruction and reflection. Over time, these conceptual frameworks would provide the basis for later reinterpretations of Atlantis as explorers, scholars, and mythmakers incorporated new discoveries, expanded navigation, and evolving scientific understanding into the persistent cultural fascination with the lost island civilization. The Minoan civilization, flourishing on the island of Crete from approximately 3000 to 1450 BCE, represents one of the earliest and most sophisticated Bronze Age societies in the Aegean region. Its development illustrates the integration of maritime technology, urban planning, and administrative organization, establishing a model of complex society well in advance of classical Greece. Archaeological evidence from palatial centers such as Knossos, Phaistos, and Millennia reveals architectural sophistication, including multi-story buildings with elaborate drainage systems, storage magazines, and frescoed walls that indicate both artistic achievement and social complexity. The organization of these urban centers suggests a centralized political authority capable of coordinating large-scale construction projects, regulating trade, and maintaining social cohesion across significant geographic distances. By examining the Minoans, scholars gain insight into the mechanisms by which early civilizations leveraged maritime resources, agricultural productivity, and technological innovations to achieve sustained cultural and economic influence. Minoan society was deeply connected to maritime trade networks throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Archaeological findings indicate extensive exchange with Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and the Cycladic Islands, involving commodities such as pottery, metals, and luxury goods. The development of long-distance seafaring allowed the Minoans to establish economic dominance, facilitating both the distribution of resources and cultural influence. Minoan ships, reconstructed through depictions in frescoes and reliefs, suggest the capability for both coastal navigation and open sea travel, indicating a sophisticated understanding of maritime technology and environmental conditions. The ability to coordinate trade over considerable distances not only enhanced wealth accumulation, but also reinforced the societal structure, providing material support for palatial administrations and associated religious institutions. By organizing and regulating trade, the Minoans demonstrated early forms of bureaucratic oversight, setting a precedent for subsequent Aegean and Mediterranean civilizations. The internal organization of Minoan society reflects a hierarchical yet collaborative structure. Palaces served as administrative, economic, and religious hubs, controlling agricultural surplus, craft production, and resource distribution. Linear A inscriptions, although not yet fully deciphered, appear on clay tablets and ceilings associated with storage facilities, suggesting systematic record-keeping and oversight. Such administrative documentation indicates that economic transactions and production were carefully monitored, allowing centralized authorities to manage both labor and material resources efficiently. These practices illustrate how complex societies could maintain cohesion, support large urban populations, and mitigate the risks of scarcity or conflict through structured governance. The combination of centralized administration with local production facilitated resilience and adaptability, enabling the Minoans to sustain a high degree of social and economic complexity over several centuries. Artistic and religious practices further reveal the values and intellectual framework of Minoan society. Frescoes depict processions, ceremonial activities, and maritime scenes, reflecting both ritual importance and engagement with the natural environment. Objects such as seal stones, pottery, and figurines suggest symbolic communication, social identity, and the reinforcement of cultural norms. Religious structures, including peak sanctuaries and palace shrines, indicate organized worship and community participation, integrating spiritual life with civic and economic functions. The prominence of natural motifs, such as marine animals and plant life, suggests an aesthetic and symbolic awareness of the surrounding environment, highlighting the Minoans' capacity to integrate observation, artistry, and ritual practice into the fabric of daily life. These cultural expressions provide insight into social cohesion, ideological frameworks, and the ways in which communal values were communicated and preserved. One of the most significant natural events impacting Minoan civilization was the eruption of the Thera volcano, approximately dated to 1600 BCE. Geological and archaeological evidence demonstrates that this eruption generated widespread devastation through ash fall, seismic activity, and tsunamis affecting coastal settlements across the Aegean. Excavations at Akrotiri reveal remarkably preserved urban structures, including multi-story buildings, storage areas, and sophisticated drainage systems, which were rapidly buried under volcanic deposits. The sudden disruption caused by Thera illustrates the vulnerability of complex societies to environmental hazards and the potential for natural disasters to precipitate political, economic, and cultural transformations. While the Minoans demonstrated resilience, maintaining trade networks and administrative structures in the aftermath, the eruption may have contributed to the gradual decline of centralized power and the eventual integration of Crete into Mycenaean cultural and political spheres. The influence of Minoan civilization extended beyond Crete through both direct and indirect interactions. Trade networks transmitted material culture, technological innovations, and artistic styles throughout the Aegean, while cultural practices and religious motifs influenced neighboring societies. The exchange of metallurgical techniques, pottery styles, and symbolic systems facilitated cross-cultural integration and adaptation, contributing to the emergence of a shared Mediterranean cultural framework. These interactions demonstrate the capacity of early civilizations to project influence over large geographic areas, reinforcing the significance of maritime networks and technological mastery in shaping political, economic, and cultural trajectories. The Minoan example illustrates how sophisticated societies could leverage resources, organization, and environmental knowledge to establish enduring legacies in both material and intellectual domains. The Minoan civilization's achievements in urban planning, administration, and maritime technology provide context for later interpretations of Atlantis. Scholars have noted parallels between Plato's description of an advanced, centrally organized island society with sophisticated engineering and the archaeological record of Minoan Crete. While no direct evidence links the historical Minoans to the Atlantis narrative, their accomplishments demonstrate that Bronze Age civilizations in the Mediterranean possessed the capacity for large-scale organization, technological innovation, and cultural complexity, which could have informed the imaginative framework of later Greek authors. This comparison highlights the interplay between empirical historical observation and the construction of philosophical or mythic narratives in classical thought. In conclusion, the Minoans exemplify the emergence of complex, maritime-oriented civilizations in the Eastern Mediterranean. Their integration of trade, administration, artistic expression, and religious practice illustrates how early societies could achieve high levels of organization, technological sophistication, and cultural influence. Environmental challenges, including the Thera eruption, demonstrate the vulnerabilities inherent to complex societies and the dynamic interplay between human innovation and natural forces. The study of Minoan Crete provides a factual foundation for understanding the development of advanced island civilizations, offering a historical lens through which the characteristics attributed to Atlantis may be examined. This understanding naturally leads to the subsequent exploration of how these societal patterns were interpreted in classical Greece, and how such examples informed both philosophical discourse and the evolving narrative of lost civilizations. The decline of the Minoan civilization occurred over the course of the Late Bronze Age, culminating around 1450 BCE, and represents a critical episode in the history of the Aegean region. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Minoan palatial system, which had provided centralized administration, storage, and ceremonial functions, experienced significant disruption during this period. Multiple factors contributed to the decline, including environmental catastrophes, external pressures, and internal socio-political changes. The eruption of Thera, dated to approximately 1600 BCE, created widespread ashfall, seismic activity, and tsunamis that affected coastal settlements throughout Crete and neighboring islands. While the Minoans demonstrated resilience in the immediate aftermath, the long-term impacts of the eruption likely weakened their economic and administrative structures, increasing vulnerability to subsequent disruptions. In addition to environmental factors, evidence indicates growing interactions and competition with Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. Archaeological layers demonstrate changes in material culture, such as shifts in pottery styles, architectural influences, and the introduction of linear B administrative scripts in later palatial centers. These changes suggest a process of cultural integration and eventual dominance by Mycenaean elites, who may have exploited the weakened Minoan infrastructure to establish political control. The combination of natural disaster, economic disruption, and external influence created conditions under which centralized Minoan authority could no longer be maintained at its previous level. Economic and maritime networks were also affected during this period. The Minoans had relied on extensive trade throughout the eastern Mediterranean, exchanging goods such as ceramics, metals, textiles, and luxury items with Egypt, Anatolia, and the Cyclades. Evidence from harbor installations, ship depictions, and imported artifacts suggests that these networks became increasingly disrupted, limiting access to critical resources and diminishing economic stability. The decline in trade would have had cascading effects on administrative capacity, artisanal production, and urban maintenance, further undermining the palatial system. Archaeological data from key sites such as Knossos, Phaistos, and Millennia reveal signs of structural damage, partial abandonment, and reconstruction attempts, indicating that the society sought to adapt to changing circumstances. Despite these efforts, The decline in palatial authority corresponded with shifts in settlement patterns, including the movement of populations from central palaces to smaller, less centralized communities. These demographic changes reflect both strategic adaptation to environmental threats and the fracturing of social cohesion, as centralized governance and ritual authority weakened. The cultural implications of this decline are also significant. Minoan religious and artistic traditions, which had flourished in the palatial centers, appear to have diminished or transformed under the influence of external populations and the pressures of social reorganization. Frescoes, pottery styles, and ritual artifacts indicate both continuity and change, reflecting an adaptive response to new political realities while retaining elements of earlier cultural identity. The survival of certain artistic motifs and symbolic forms illustrates the persistence of Minoan influence even as the political and economic structures that supported them eroded. The decline of the Minoans illustrates broader patterns observed in early complex societies, wherein environmental vulnerability, external pressures, and internal dynamics interact to precipitate systemic change. Their experience demonstrates the limits of centralized authority in the face of natural and social stressors, providing a historical case study in the resilience and fragility of complex societies. It also highlights the ways in which disasters and societal transformations can be encoded into cultural memory, influencing subsequent narratives of lost civilizations and human achievement. Understanding the Minoan collapse offers valuable context for interpreting later historical and literary accounts of advanced island civilizations, including the narrative of Atlantis. Plato's depiction of a technologically sophisticated society destroyed by cataclysm parallels the archaeological record of Minoan Crete, suggesting that real-world events may have informed mythic or philosophical constructions. While Atlantis remains a narrative of allegorical purpose, the Minoan experience demonstrates that societies in the ancient Mediterranean did achieve levels of complexity sufficient to inspire both historical and literary reflection. This analysis of decline also emphasizes the interplay between environmental and human factors in shaping the trajectory of civilizations. The eruption of Thera, combined with shifting trade dynamics, external pressures from the Mycenaean mainland, and internal socio-political adaptations, illustrates the multifaceted nature of societal transformation. It underscores the importance of evaluating historical change through an integrated lens that considers technological, environmental, economic, and cultural dimensions. In conclusion, the collapse of Minoan civilization represents a pivotal moment in the Bronze Age Aegean. The interplay of natural disasters, economic disruption, and external influence reshaped the island's social and political landscape, creating conditions for new cultural and political configurations under Mycenaean influence. The Minoans' decline provides a factual framework for understanding the vulnerability of complex societies and the mechanisms by which cultural memory preserves the legacy of once dominant civilizations. This historical episode establishes a foundation for subsequent Mediterranean narratives of lost civilizations, forming a plausible template for the development of mythic accounts such as Atlantis. It also informs modern archaeological interpretation by illustrating how the material record preserves evidence of both human achievement and the consequences of environmental and social disruption, guiding analysis of subsequent island civilizations and their portrayal in later historical and philosophical literature. Plato's account of Atlantis, recorded in the dialogues Timaeus and Critias during the 4th century BCE, represents one of the earliest comprehensive descriptions of a lost civilization within classical literature. These works provide a detailed narrative, integrating geographic, political, and technological elements to convey a society that, despite its sophistication, ultimately succumbed to moral decline. Plato situates Atlantis beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a term generally understood to refer to the Strait of Gibraltar, thereby locating the island at the outer edge of the known Mediterranean world. The narrative presents Atlantis as a large, organized island society with a structured government, extensive infrastructure, and substantial military capability, framed to illustrate philosophical principles rather than historical fact. Plato's dialogues emphasize the consequences of hubris, the importance of ethical governance, and the relationship between power and morality, establishing the primary purpose of the Atlantis narrative as pedagogical rather than documentary. The reception of Plato's writings in the classical world contributed significantly to the enduring presence of the Atlantis narrative. Among Greek philosophers and historians, the story was noted for its moral and political lessons, often analyzed in conjunction with Plato's broader discussions of ideal forms, governance, and the ethical responsibilities of rulers. While some contemporaries interpreted the account as a factual report derived from Egyptian records, others emphasized its allegorical function. This dual interpretation facilitated the integration of Atlantis into intellectual discourse, allowing the narrative to function as both a cautionary tale and a reference point for theoretical exploration of civilization, power, and societal collapse. The structure of Plato's narrative reflects a detailed understanding of social organization and technological innovation. Atlantis is described as divided into 10 regions, each governed by a king descended from a central lineage. Administrative control is exercised through established legal frameworks, with oversight mechanisms designed to maintain balance among territories. The text emphasizes the presence of urban planning, including concentric rings of land and water, bridges, canals, and fortified harbors, indicating a society capable of complex engineering and large-scale coordination. These descriptions, while literary, parallel characteristics observable in early Bronze Age civilizations, such as Minoan Crete, where palatial centers managed economic, religious, and civic functions. The integration of technical detail into Plato's narrative lends credibility to the account while simultaneously serving as a vehicle for exploring moral and political lessons. Plato's inclusion of Egyptian sources further situates Atlantis within a broader Mediterranean context. According to the dialogues, Egyptian priests recounted the story of Atlantis to Solon, who then transmitted it to Athens. This framing device emphasizes the antiquity and cultural authority of the narrative, suggesting that knowledge of Atlantis derived from an older, ostensibly reliable tradition. While modern scholarship generally considers these references to be literary constructions, they reflect a historical awareness of Egypt as a center of knowledge and record-keeping. Egyptian engagement in long-distance trade, urban administration, and ceremonial documentation would have made them a plausible source for ancient Greek audiences, reinforcing the narrative's intellectual and cultural credibility. The philosophical dimensions of the Atlantis story underscore its role in illustrating the interplay between societal organization and ethical conduct. Plato presents Atlantis as initially virtuous and prosperous, with its rulers guided by principles of moderation, justice, and service to the community. Over time, however, the society is described as becoming corrupt, indulging in excess, and losing sight of these foundational values. This moral decline is directly linked to the eventual destruction of Atlantis, a sudden and catastrophic event that eliminates the island civilization. In doing so, Plato demonstrates a causal relationship between ethical failure and societal collapse, emphasizing the importance of maintaining civic virtue, lawful governance, and ethical stewardship of resources. The enduring influence of Plato's narrative within the classical world is further reflected in the commentaries and interpretations of later Hellenistic and Roman scholars. Authors such as Plutarch and Strabo engaged with the story, examining both its plausibility and philosophical implications. These analyses reveal the flexibility of the narrative. It could be treated as historical, allegorical, or instructive, depending on the analytical framework employed. The adaptability of Atlantis within classical discourse facilitated its transmission across centuries, ensuring that subsequent generations could access the narrative in diverse cultural and intellectual contexts. Plato's detailed presentation of Atlantis also illustrates the classical integration of geography, technology, and political structure. By situating the island beyond known boundaries, he creates a context in which advanced engineering, urban planning, and social organization are plausible without immediate empirical verification. Features such as concentric canals, harbor systems, and organized agricultural management exemplify a comprehensive vision of statecraft and societal infrastructure. The narrative thus functions on multiple levels, It conveys information about governance, technological capability, and resource management while embedding moral and philosophical instruction. The interrelation of these elements exemplifies how classical authors combined empirical observation, imaginative projection, and ethical reasoning to produce cohesive and instructive narratives. The long-term significance of Plato's record of Atlantis lies in its role as a reference point for later speculation, inquiry, and myth-making. By providing precise descriptions of political, geographic, and technological features, the dialogues created a model of an advanced civilization that could be debated, analyzed, and interpreted across centuries. The narrative's ambiguity regarding historicity enabled it to persist as both a philosophical text and a subject of historical curiosity, bridging gaps between literature, philosophy, and proto-historical investigation. Over time, Atlantis became a framework through which scholars, storytellers, and intellectuals could explore themes of societal development, environmental vulnerability, moral responsibility, and the consequences of hubris. In examining Plato's legacy, it is essential to recognize the methodological significance of his approach. By combining narrative detail, moral instruction, and geographic framing, he provided a model for analyzing complex societies, their vulnerabilities, and the relationship between ethics and governance. This approach has influenced subsequent intellectual traditions, establishing a precedent for integrating observation, theoretical reasoning, and narrative construction. The recording of Atlantis demonstrates the potential for literature to function as a vehicle for interdisciplinary inquiry, incorporating elements of history, geography, philosophy, and social science into a cohesive account designed to instruct and provoke reflection. In conclusion, Plato's documentation of Atlantis represents both a philosophical instrument and a narrative of enduring intellectual influence. Its integration of moral, political, and technical dimensions allowed the story to operate simultaneously as an instructive allegory and a framework for considering historical plausibility. The dual interpretive possibilities ensured its transmission and adaptation across centuries, influencing classical scholarship, Hellenistic commentary, and Roman intellectual engagement. Plato's methodological rigor, combined with the imaginative integration of geography and social complexity, establishes Atlantis as a foundational reference in the study of lost civilizations, providing a benchmark against which later narratives, speculation, and archaeological interpretations can be measured. This account naturally bridges into subsequent exploration of how Atlantis was received and interpreted during the Hellenistic and Roman periods, as scholars and commentators engaged with both its ethical lessons and its geographical and historical claims. During the Hellenistic and Roman periods, the narrative of Atlantis continued to attract intellectual attention, interpreted through the lenses of philosophy, historiography, and emerging scientific inquiry. Following Plato's composition of Timaeus and Critias, Greek and Roman scholars engaged with the story, often debating its factual basis while simultaneously considering its moral and philosophical implications. Hellenistic commentators, writing between the 4th and 1st centuries BCE, recognized the story as a vehicle for exploring societal organization, technological capability, and ethical governance. These scholars were particularly interested in the interplay between wealth, power, and moral conduct, viewing Atlantis as both a cautionary exemplar and a theoretical construct. By examining this period, it is possible to trace the ways in which the narrative was integrated into broader intellectual traditions, shaping both historical discourse and cultural imagination. Strabo, the Greek geographer of the 1st century BCE, referenced Atlantis in his Geographica, treating the account cautiously while situating it within the broader Mediterranean and Atlantic context. Although he expressed skepticism about the literal existence of the island, Strabo acknowledged the story's value in illustrating the limits of human knowledge regarding distant lands. Similarly, Plutarch, writing in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, emphasized the ethical and instructive dimensions of the Atlantis narrative, discussing it in relation to questions of morality, governance, and the impermanence of political power. These perspectives demonstrate a growing trend in classical scholarship, treating the narrative as an intellectual tool rather than a strict historical account, while preserving its influence on discussions of societal development and decline. The Hellenistic period also saw increasing attention to geographic and historical analysis, particularly in Alexandria, where scholars sought to reconcile mythic accounts with empirical observation. The Library of Alexandria, as a center of scholarship, facilitated the collection and examination of texts concerning distant lands, natural phenomena, and historical records. Within this intellectual milieu, Atlantis was examined alongside reports of Phoenician voyages, Egyptian archives, and earlier Greek exploratory accounts. Scholars debated the plausibility of an island civilization located beyond the known boundaries of the Mediterranean, often highlighting inconsistencies or gaps in the narrative while acknowledging its value as a conceptual model for exploring societal structure, technological achievement, and moral decay. Roman authors, including Cicero and later historians, engage with Atlantis primarily through the prism of moral and political philosophy. Cicero, in his discussions of ideal governance and civic virtue, referenced Plato's account as an example of the consequences of societal corruption and ethical failure. Roman intellectuals were particularly attuned to the narrative's cautionary dimensions, interpreting the destruction of Atlantis as emblematic of the vulnerability of advanced societies to internal decay and external forces. The story was also cited in rhetorical and educational contexts, illustrating the potential for allegorical and hypothetical narratives to convey practical lessons about leadership, justice, and the management of resources. During this period, the blending of historical skepticism and philosophical reflection became a defining feature of the reception of Atlantis. Commentators recognized the narrative's moral and ethical focus while engaging with its geographic and technological descriptions, seeking to distinguish between plausible historical inference and literary construction. This dual approach enabled the story to maintain relevance, offering insights into human behavior, societal organization, and environmental vulnerability. In particular, the account encouraged reflection on how wealth and power could lead to hubris, excess, and ultimately the collapse of even technologically advanced civilizations. Archaeological knowledge and material culture available during the Hellenistic and Roman periods informed interpretations of Atlantis in indirect ways. Knowledge of Mediterranean urban centers, maritime technology, and trade networks provided concrete reference points for assessing the plausibility of Plato's descriptions. The existence of sophisticated infrastructure, palatial administration, and long-distance commerce in contemporary societies offered analogues that could be compared to the narrative of Atlantis. These comparisons reinforced the notion that the story, while allegorical, drew upon observable patterns in human society, thereby enhancing its instructive and intellectual value. The story of Atlantis also functioned as a focal point for speculation about lost knowledge and vanished civilizations. Roman authors and later commentators often linked Atlantis with broader discussions of geological phenomena, cataclysms, and the impermanence of human achievement. These reflections reveal an emerging awareness of environmental factors in historical change, illustrating an early recognition that natural forces could profoundly impact human societies. The Hellenistic and Roman engagement with Atlantis thus reflects both a philosophical interest in ethics and governance and a proto-scientific curiosity about the natural and human worlds. The endurance of the Atlantis narrative during these periods demonstrates the adaptability of classical texts to diverse intellectual contexts. While Plato's original dialogue presented Atlantis primarily as a moral and philosophical example, later Hellenistic and Roman interpretations integrated empirical observation, critical skepticism, and comparative analysis. The narrative could be employed to explore ethics, history, geography, and technology simultaneously, providing a multidimensional framework for inquiry. This flexibility allowed Atlantis to persist as a subject of debate, reflection, and instruction, bridging literary, historical, and philosophical traditions. By the late Roman period, the Atlantis narrative had acquired a symbolic status, representing both the limits of human understanding and the consequences of societal overreach. Its transmission through libraries, commentaries, and educational curricula ensured that the story would survive into the medieval period, influencing both scholarly and popular perceptions of ancient history. The story's ability to accommodate multiple interpretive approaches, philosophical, historical, and geographic, ensured its relevance across centuries and cultures, setting a precedent for the enduring fascination with lost civilizations. In summary, Hellenistic and Roman engagement with the Atlantis narrative exemplifies the integration of philosophical reflection, historical analysis, and geographic speculation in classical scholarship. Scholars treated the account both critically and instructively, balancing moral lessons with considerations of plausibility and empirical observation. The story's endurance during this period underscores its utility as a tool for examining the relationship between ethics, governance, technological achievement, and environmental factors. This stage of interpretation laid the foundation for later medieval, Renaissance, and modern treatments of Atlantis, ensuring that the narrative would continue to inspire intellectual inquiry, cultural reflection, and imaginative exploration across diverse contexts. The Hellenistic and Roman reinterpretations provide a bridge to subsequent periods, where the narrative would be further transformed and adapted, reflecting evolving understandings of geography, history, and human society. During the medieval period, the reception of Atlantis was shaped by the intellectual and religious frameworks of Christian Europe, which emphasized biblical chronology, moral instruction, and the interpretation of historical events through theological perspectives. Classical texts, including Plato's dialogues, were transmitted primarily through Latin translations, often accompanied by commentaries that framed the narratives in ways compatible with Christian thought. In this context, Atlantis was frequently interpreted not as a literal island civilization, but as a cautionary example illustrating divine judgment, moral decline, and the impermanence of human power. The narrative was incorporated into broader discussions of pre-flood history, the moral lessons of lost civilizations, and the relationship between human ambition and divine providence. Medieval scholars often associated the story of Atlantis with the biblical flood and other cataclysmic events described in Scripture. The sudden destruction of the island was interpreted as an instance of divine retribution, reinforcing prevailing theological notions regarding human sinfulness and the consequences of ethical failure. Chroniclers and theologians used the Atlantis narrative to illustrate that even the most advanced and prosperous societies are vulnerable to collapse when moral and spiritual obligations are neglected. This integration into Christian historiography demonstrates the adaptability of the story, allowing it to be utilized as both a moral exemplum and a point of reference in discussions of historical chronology and cosmology. The transmission of classical texts during the early and high Middle Ages facilitated the preservation of Plato's dialogues, often through the works of Boethius and other Latin commentators. These texts were studied in monastic and cathedral schools, where the focus was frequently on ethical and philosophical content rather than historical verification. As a result, the Atlantis narrative was filtered through a pedagogical lens that emphasized moral and didactic interpretation. Its geographic and technological details were generally treated as illustrative rather than factual, consistent with the broader medieval approach to classical literature, in which exempla and allegory were central to instruction in ethics, governance, and spiritual reflection. In addition to theological interpretation, medieval cartography and chronicles occasionally incorporated references to lost lands, drawing upon both classical sources and oral traditions. These accounts frequently situated Atlantis within the Atlantic or distant oceanic regions, emphasizing its remoteness and inaccessibility. While the physical existence of the island was rarely asserted with confidence, its inclusion in geographic speculation reflects the medieval fascination with the unknown and the boundaries of the known world. The narrative functions simultaneously as a moral warning and as a framework for contemplating the extent and limits of human exploration, reflecting the dual concerns of medieval scholarship, spiritual instruction, and empirical curiosity. Literary and encyclopedic sources from the medieval period, such as Vincent of Beauvais' Speculum Maius, occasionally referenced Atlantis indirectly, presenting it alongside other legendary or semi-historical civilizations. These references reinforce the perception of Atlantis as a symbol of human hubris and the impermanence of worldly power. By situating the island within a broader compendium of knowledge, Medieval intellectuals integrated classical narratives into their cosmological and moral frameworks, demonstrating continuity with antiquity while adapting content to align with Christian ethical and historical perspectives. The story's moral emphasis, rather than its literal historicity, became the focal point of interpretation, highlighting the didactic priorities of medieval scholarship. The medieval reception of Atlantis also illustrates the persistence of cultural memory across linguistic, religious, and intellectual transitions. Despite the decline of classical institutions, the narrative survived in a modified form, transmitted through monastic education, encyclopedic compilation, and commentary traditions. Its endurance reflects both the authority of Plato's text and the adaptability of the story to diverse intellectual contexts. Medieval scholars, while often skeptical of the literal existence of distant lands, recognized the value of the narrative as a tool for ethical reflection, philosophical debate, and consideration of societal stability. This interpretive approach ensured that Atlantis remained accessible to later Renaissance scholars, who would engage with the narrative in the context of emerging historical, geographic, and scientific inquiry. Archaeological and textual analysis suggest that the medieval emphasis on moral and theological interpretation contributed to the development of a layered understanding of Atlantis. The narrative functioned as both a reflection on human ethics and an imaginative engagement with geography and lost civilizations. By situating the story within Christian chronology and moral pedagogy, medieval scholars reinforced the didactic potential of the account while preserving its broader intellectual and cultural resonance. The emphasis on divine causality, ethical instruction, and the temporality of human achievement provided a framework for understanding societal collapse that would influence later philosophical and literary treatments of Atlantis. In summary, the medieval reception of Atlantis reflects the adaptation of classical narratives to Christian intellectual frameworks, emphasizing moral instruction, ethical reflection, and theological integration. The story was preserved through translation, commentary, and inclusion in encyclopedic and literary works, ensuring its survival across centuries. Its interpretation was characterized by an emphasis on divine judgment, moral decline, and the transience of human achievement, rather than empirical verification of geographic or technological claims. This approach established a continuity of cultural memory and ethical discourse that bridged antiquity and the Renaissance, setting the stage for the rediscovery and reinterpretation of Atlantis in early modern Europe. By embedding the narrative within the moral and historical consciousness of the medieval period, the story of Atlantis remained both instructive and influential, providing a foundation for subsequent inquiry into lost civilizations, human ambition, and the ethical dimensions of societal organization. The Renaissance, spanning roughly from the 14th to the 17th century, marked a period of renewed interest in classical antiquity, humanist scholarship, and empirical inquiry. During this era, the narrative of Atlantis experienced a revival, as scholars and intellectuals revisited Plato's dialogues with a combination of reverence for classical authority and curiosity about the physical world. Humanist scholars, such as Marsilio Ficino and Giovanni Battista Pio, engaged with Plato's works in Latin translation, exploring both the philosophical content and the historical implications of the Atlantis story. The period's emphasis on critical analysis, textual fidelity, and comparative study fostered a re-examination of the narrative, highlighting its potential as both an ethical allegory and a reflection of ancient Mediterranean knowledge. Renaissance humanists approached Atlantis with an increased interest in geography and empirical evidence. The rediscovery of classical texts coincided with expanding European exploration, as navigators charted previously unknown regions and returned with first-hand accounts of distant lands. The juxtaposition of textual study with emerging geographic knowledge encouraged speculation about the possible real-world counterparts of Plato's island. Cartographers and chroniclers occasionally incorporated references to Atlantis or similar lost lands on maps and in travel narratives, blending classical sources with contemporary observation. This integration demonstrates the period's growing interest in reconciling literary and historical accounts with tangible geographic evidence, a hallmark of Renaissance intellectual inquiry. Scholars of the Renaissance also emphasized the moral and philosophical dimensions of the Atlantis narrative. Plato's account was interpreted as a study in human virtue, civic responsibility, and the consequences of corruption and overreach. Commentators explored the parallels between Atlantis and contemporary European states, reflecting on the dangers of hubris, the responsibilities of rulers, and the maintenance of societal cohesion. By situating Atlantis within both a classical and contemporary framework, Renaissance thinkers leveraged the narrative as a tool for ethical reflection, political discourse, and philosophical engagement. The story's lessons were applicable not only in the abstract, but also in evaluating the conduct of emerging nation-states, trading republics, and dynastic powers. The technological and urban details described by Plato continued to capture scholarly attention. Renaissance analyses highlighted the concentric canal systems, harbor engineering, and architectural planning attributed to Atlantis, comparing these elements with archaeological knowledge of Mediterranean civilizations such as the Minoans, Mycenaeans, and Phoenicians. While no direct evidence confirmed the existence of Atlantis, the plausibility of these features suggested that the narrative drew upon the achievements of real Bronze Age societies. This comparative approach reflects the period's methodological shift toward combining textual study with observation of the material world, a precursor to later historical and archaeological investigation. Renaissance cartography further amplified the fascination with Atlantis. Maps produced during the 15th and 16th centuries occasionally depicted islands in the Atlantic Ocean or other distant regions, drawing inspiration from classical sources, contemporary exploration, and speculative geography. Figures such as Abraham Ortelius and Gerardus Mercator engaged with the idea of lost or submerged lands, blending myth, literature, and emerging empirical knowledge. These representations underscore the era's dynamic interplay between imagination, scholarly interpretation, and empirical observation, illustrating how Atlantis was conceptualized as both a moral narrative and a potential geographical reality. In addition to cartography and textual scholarship, Renaissance literature and commentary contributed to the persistence of Atlantis in European thought. Writers and philosophers explored the story as a framework for discussing societal evolution, technological achievement, and environmental factors. The narrative's emphasis on the consequences of moral failure resonated with broader humanist concerns about governance, civic responsibility, and the cultivation of virtue. Through careful study of Plato's texts and comparison with historical and contemporary knowledge, Renaissance scholars reinforced the enduring relevance of Atlantis as both an ethical exemplar and a subject of intellectual inquiry. The Renaissance reception of Atlantis also illustrates the interplay between classical revival and emerging scientific thought. The period's emphasis on observation, experimentation, and critical textual analysis created conditions for a more systematic approach to evaluating ancient narratives. Scholars were increasingly attentive to discrepancies between textual description and geographic reality, while still appreciating the story's instructive and allegorical value. This analytical approach foreshadowed the development of modern historical and archaeological methods, emphasizing evidence-based reasoning alongside literary interpretation. The enduring impact of Renaissance engagement with Atlantis is evident in its influence on later Enlightenment and early modern thought. By situating the narrative within the context of humanist scholarship, empirical observation, and comparative study, Renaissance intellectuals established a framework for considering lost civilizations in a manner that combined ethical reflection with inquiry into historical plausibility. The period reinforced the dual nature of Atlantis as both a moral allegory and a potential historical reality, creating a foundation for subsequent investigations, debates, and imaginative reinterpretations in the early modern period. In summary, the Renaissance revival of Atlantis represents a critical phase in the transmission and reinterpretation of Plato's narrative. Humanist scholars integrated classical texts, ethical reflection, geographic exploration, and comparative study to examine the story from multiple perspectives. The period emphasized the plausibility of the island's technological and societal achievements while maintaining focus on the narrative's moral and philosophical lessons. Cartography, literature, and textual scholarship collectively reinforced the cultural and intellectual significance of Atlantis, ensuring its continued relevance in European thought. This renewed attention bridged classical antiquity and early modern inquiry, setting the stage for the development of systematic investigation, speculative geography, and the enduring fascination with lost civilizations that would characterize subsequent centuries. The Renaissance rediscovery thus establishes a clear trajectory leading to Enlightenment curiosity, scientific skepticism, and the evolving integration of Atlantis into historical, literary, and archaeological discourse. The Enlightenment, spanning the 17th and 18th centuries, marked a decisive shift in European approaches to history, philosophy, and empirical inquiry, profoundly influencing interpretations of Atlantis. Thinkers of this era emphasized reason, critical analysis, and the systematic evaluation of evidence, seeking to distinguish historical fact from myth and allegory. In this context, Plato's narrative of Atlantis underwent renewed scrutiny, as scholars applied emerging methodologies in textual criticism, comparative history, and geography to assess the plausibility of a lost island civilization. The Enlightenment approach was characterized by skepticism of unverified claims, a reliance on documented evidence, and the integration of natural philosophy into historical interpretation, positioning Atlantis as a subject for rational investigation rather than purely moral or allegorical reflection. Enlightenment scholars critically analyzed classical sources, particularly Plato's Timaeus and Critias, with an emphasis on linguistic precision, historical context, and internal consistency. Commentators such as Richard Bentley and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz examined the dialogues alongside contemporaneous geographic knowledge, evaluating the plausibility of the described island's size, location, and technological achievements. These analyses often contrasted the narrative against empirical observations of the Mediterranean and Atlantic regions, identifying discrepancies while acknowledging that the story reflected broader patterns of social organization and human ambition. The critical approach established a framework for considering Atlantis as a historical problem rather than solely a moral allegory, emphasizing the need for evidence-based assessment. Geographic exploration during the Enlightenment further influenced interpretations of Atlantis. European navigators were increasingly charting the Atlantic, Caribbean, and Mediterranean regions, providing first-hand data on islands, ocean currents, and maritime conditions. Reports from explorers were compared with Plato's descriptions, prompting debate about whether a historical basis for Atlantis could exist. Scholars considered factors such as the size and topography of the island, the plausibility of concentric canal systems, and the logistical feasibility of a society capable of coordinating large-scale engineering projects. These discussions reflected the era's commitment to reconciling textual analysis with empirical observation, an intellectual practice that laid the groundwork for modern historical geography and archaeology. Enlightenment thinkers also explored the technological and societal dimensions of Atlantis in the context of historical development. The narrative was interpreted as illustrating the progression of civilization, the relationship between governance and societal stability, and the consequences of moral and environmental mismanagement. Analyses emphasized the administrative sophistication, engineering prowess, and organized military capacity attributed to Atlantis, drawing comparisons with historical civilizations such as the Minoans, Mycenaeans, and Egyptians. By situating the story within comparative frameworks, scholars could extract lessons about human achievement, governance, and the vulnerability of complex societies, highlighting the narrative's continued relevance to philosophical and historical inquiry. The period also witnessed the integration of natural philosophy into discussions of Atlantis. Scholars examined geological, hydrological, and seismological phenomena, considering whether catastrophic events could explain the disappearance of an advanced island civilization. Theories included volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and oceanic submersion, reflecting a growing understanding of the dynamic relationship between human societies and environmental forces. By incorporating scientific reasoning into historical analysis, Enlightenment thinkers demonstrated that Atlantis could serve as a conceptual bridge between empirical observation and philosophical reflection, illustrating the consequences of hubris, mismanagement, and natural catastrophe on societal continuity. In addition to scholarly inquiry, the Enlightenment fostered popular engagement with the Atlantis narrative. Philosophers, historians, and writers disseminated discussions of the lost island in essays, treatises, and compilations, emphasizing rational investigation alongside ethical interpretation. The story captured the imagination of a broader literate public who were increasingly interested in the interplay between human achievement, societal collapse, and natural phenomena. This cultural engagement reinforced the dual nature of Atlantis as both a subject of empirical investigation and a narrative with enduring moral and philosophical significance. The critical approaches developed during the Enlightenment laid the foundation for subsequent archaeological and historical investigation. By emphasizing evidence-based reasoning, comparative analysis, and the integration of natural science, scholars established methodological standards that continue to inform modern inquiries into lost civilizations. The period's engagement with Atlantis illustrates the capacity of classical narratives to adapt to evolving intellectual paradigms, maintaining relevance across cultural, disciplinary, and temporal contexts. Furthermore, it demonstrates how myth and history can coexist as analytical categories, allowing researchers to extract lessons about societal development, environmental vulnerability, and human ingenuity while recognizing the limitations of surviving evidence. In summary, Enlightenment investigation of Atlantis represents a crucial moment in the evolution of historical criticism and empirical inquiry. Scholars applied reason, observation, and comparative methodology to assess Plato's narrative, balancing skepticism with the recognition of potential historical foundations. The integration of textual analysis, geographic exploration, and natural philosophy enabled a multidimensional understanding of the narrative, highlighting both its instructive value and its plausibility as a model for human societies. This approach ensured that Atlantis remained a subject of intellectual interest, bridging classical literature, emerging science, and philosophical discourse. The Enlightenment's rational and methodical engagement with Atlantis set the stage for 19th and 20th century archaeological, geological, and literary exploration, establishing a lasting framework for interpreting the intersection of myth, history, and human ambition. The 19th century witnessed a surge of archaeological discovery, exploration, and speculative geography that profoundly shaped interpretations of Atlantis. During this period, European scholars and explorers increasingly sought to reconcile classical narratives with material evidence, motivated by the expansion of scientific archaeology and the systematic study of ancient civilizations. Excavations across the Mediterranean, Near East, and North Africa revealed previously unknown sites, palatial centers, and artifacts, providing concrete reference points for evaluating the plausibility of Plato's account. These discoveries, combined with advances in geology, oceanography, and cartography, encouraged speculation regarding lost civilizations and submerged lands, situating Atlantis within both historical inquiry and imaginative geography. Archaeological excavations of the 19th century provided a new empirical basis for comparing ancient civilizations with Plato's description of Atlantis. The rediscovery of Minoan palaces at Knossos, Phaistos, and Millennia by archaeologists such as Sir Arthur Evans revealed sophisticated urban planning, advanced engineering, and centralized administration in Bronze Age Crete. These findings demonstrated that societies in the ancient Mediterranean were capable of the technological and organizational achievements attributed to Atlantis, including complex infrastructure, large-scale construction, and coordinated governance. While Evans and his contemporaries did not claim to have discovered Atlantis itself, the Minoan civilization became a compelling historical analog, inspiring both scholarly debate and public imagination. Speculative geography also flourished during this period, as cartographers and explorers considered the possibility of submerged lands in the Atlantic and other remote regions. Oceanic surveys, combined with emerging knowledge of sea currents, tidal patterns, and underwater topography, encouraged theorists to explore whether an island of the scale described by Plato could have existed and later disappeared. Writers such as Ignatius Donnelly advanced detailed hypotheses linking geological events, such as volcanic eruptions or tectonic shifts, with the sudden disappearance of Atlantis. Donnelly's work, though controversial, exemplified the period's enthusiasm for combining classical texts, empirical observation, and imaginative reasoning in the quest to identify lost civilizations. In addition to physical evidence, the 19th century saw a renewed interest in cultural and linguistic parallels. Scholars examined similarities in mythology, religious symbolism, and technological development across Mediterranean and Atlantic societies. Comparative studies of architecture, metallurgy, and urban organization suggested patterns of societal evolution that could correspond to Plato's descriptions, reinforcing the plausibility of a highly organized, technologically advanced island civilization. These analyses also reflected the era's broader interest in identifying universal principles of human development and tracing the diffusion of cultural innovations across regions and epochs. The period's fascination with Atlantis extended into popular literature, scientific speculation, and emerging pseudoscientific discourse. Writers and enthusiasts debated potential locations, causes of destruction, and connections with other mythic or historical civilizations, blending rigorous observation with imaginative extrapolation. This intersection of scholarly research and public fascination illustrates the dual function of Atlantis during the 19th century. It served as both a platform for intellectual inquiry and a narrative canvas for exploring human achievement, environmental vulnerability, and the limits of historical knowledge. Geological and environmental studies played an increasingly central role in these discussions. Investigators considered natural phenomena such as earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and rising sea levels as mechanisms capable of submerging islands and reshaping coastlines. The emerging science of paleogeography enabled researchers to model historical landscapes, providing insight into how natural disasters could transform human settlements. These approaches highlighted the interplay between environmental forces and societal resilience, underscoring that the disappearance of civilizations, whether real or hypothetical, could result from both human and natural factors. The 19th century approach to Atlantis reflects the period's broader intellectual climate, characterized by optimism in scientific methodology, confidence in historical reconstruction, and fascination with the unknown. Scholars and enthusiasts alike sought to reconcile the allegorical, moral, and literary dimensions of the narrative with empirical investigation, demonstrating a commitment to bridging the gap between classical texts and observable reality. This engagement laid the groundwork for later 20th century explorations, underwater archaeology, and interdisciplinary study, establishing Atlantis as a locus where literature, history, and science intersect. In summary, the 19th century represents a critical stage in the evolution of Atlantis scholarship. Archaeological discoveries, particularly of Minoan Crete, provided tangible examples of advanced Bronze Age civilizations capable of achievements reminiscent of Plato's description. Speculative geography, comparative cultural studies, and emerging geological science expanded the framework for considering Atlantis as a potentially real phenomenon, while simultaneously reinforcing its narrative, ethical, and allegorical significance. This period illustrates the integration of empirical observation, imaginative reasoning, and classical scholarship, ensuring that Atlantis remained both a subject of intellectual inquiry and a powerful cultural symbol. The 19th century investigations thus establish a direct connection to modern archaeological, geological, and interdisciplinary approaches, paving the way for contemporary exploration of lost civilizations, submerged landscapes, and the enduring allure of Atlantis in both academic and popular imagination. The 20th century marked a transformative period in the study of Atlantis, characterized by the application of systematic scientific methods, advances in archaeology and geology, and the emergence of interdisciplinary research. Unlike earlier speculative approaches, researchers now had access to modern excavation techniques, radiocarbon dating, underwater exploration, and a more comprehensive understanding of ancient civilizations and environmental processes. These developments allowed scholars to evaluate the plausibility of Atlantis as a historical phenomenon, distinguish myth from material evidence, and situate Plato's narrative within a broader scientific framework. The period represents a turning point in the integration of classical texts, empirical observation, and technological innovation in the study of lost civilizations. Archaeological investigations during the 20th century provided significant insights into ancient Mediterranean societies, particularly the Minoan civilization of Crete. Excavations at Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and other sites employed stratigraphic analysis, typology of artifacts, and radiocarbon dating to establish precise chronologies. These findings demonstrated that Minoan society possessed advanced urban planning, complex administrative systems, and sophisticated engineering comparable to the descriptions in Plato's Atlantis. While no evidence definitively identified Atlantis, the material culture of Crete provided a historical analog that could explain the origins of Plato's narrative and demonstrate that such advanced societies existed in the Bronze Age. Geological research also played a central role in 20th century investigations. Studies of seismic activity, volcanic eruptions, and tectonic plate movement in the Mediterranean and Atlantic regions provided plausible mechanisms for catastrophic destruction and submergence of landmasses. The eruption of Thera, Santorini, around 1600 BCE, for example, generated tsunamis, ashfall, and seismic disturbances that would have devastated coastal communities and altered trade networks. These environmental events offered a scientifically grounded explanation for the disappearance of a civilization or the exaggeration of its demise in oral or literary traditions, bridging natural processes with historical narratives. Underwater archaeology further expanded the possibilities for identifying submerged sites potentially linked to Atlantis. Technological advances, including sonar mapping, scuba exploration, and submersible vehicles, enabled researchers to explore previously inaccessible regions of the Mediterranean and Atlantic. Discoveries of sunken settlements, harbor structures, and artifacts demonstrated the feasibility of lost or submerged human habitation, reinforcing the notion that environmental changes could profoundly impact human societies. Although no site has been conclusively identified as Atlantis, these investigations validated the broader hypothesis that natural disasters could erase complex civilizations from the visible archaeological record. Comparative analysis of ancient texts and material culture also deepened in the 20th century. Scholars examined Minoan, Mycenaean, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian sources to identify shared technological, administrative, and religious characteristics. The presence of large palatial complexes, complex trade networks, and hierarchical governance in the Bronze Age provided empirical support for the plausibility of advanced societies like Atlantis. Such comparative studies highlighted the interconnectedness of early civilizations, illustrating patterns of social complexity, environmental adaptation, and cultural diffusion that informed interpretations of Plato's narrative. The 20th century also witnessed critical evaluation of prior speculative claims. Researchers applied rigorous methodological standards to challenge unsubstantiated theories, distinguishing between imaginative hypotheses and empirically grounded conclusions. Works by archaeologists such as Spiridon Marinatos, who investigated the Thera eruption, demonstrated how precise fieldwork, stratigraphic analysis, and radiocarbon dating could clarify historical events that might have inspired the Atlantis narrative. These efforts emphasized scientific rigor, ensuring that claims about Atlantis were subjected to evidence-based scrutiny rather than literary or anecdotal persuasion. Despite the emphasis on scientific inquiry, the Atlantis narrative continued to capture popular imagination. Publications, documentaries, and media coverage explored the mystery of the Lost Island, integrating scientific findings with historical speculation. This intersection between academic research and popular culture illustrates the dual role of Atlantis in the 20th century. It remained a subject of rigorous scientific study while retaining its allure as a narrative of human achievement, catastrophe, and moral reflection. Researchers engaged both professional audiences and the general public, demonstrating that classical narratives can inspire empirical inquiry as well as cultural fascination. In conclusion, 20th century scientific approaches to Atlantis combined archaeology, geology, underwater exploration, and comparative historical analysis to situate Plato's narrative within a credible empirical framework. Excavations of Minoan Crete, studies of volcanic and seismic events, and the emergence of underwater archaeology provided plausible explanations for the disappearance of advanced civilizations, illustrating the intersection of human achievement and environmental vulnerability. Critical evaluation of prior theories ensured methodological rigor, while ongoing public interest maintained the narrative's cultural resonance. This period established a foundation for interdisciplinary approaches to lost civilizations, integrating literary, historical, and scientific perspectives. By combining empirical evidence with careful analysis of classical texts, 20th-century research advanced understanding of the conditions under which societies rise, flourish, and sometimes vanish, providing context for both historical inquiry and the enduring fascination with Atlantis as a symbol of human achievement, fragility, and the consequences of natural and societal forces. Advances in underwater archaeology and oceanographic research during the 20th century significantly expanded the investigation of submerged landscapes, providing new avenues for exploring the potential historical foundations of Atlantis. Technological innovations, including sonar mapping, remotely operated vehicles, scuba diving, and submersible equipment, enabled systematic exploration of coastal regions, continental shelves, and sunken settlements. These developments allowed researchers to identify submerged structures, harbor installations, and ancient habitations that had previously been inaccessible, demonstrating that environmental change, tectonic activity, and rising sea levels could indeed erase visible evidence of once thriving human communities. One of the most significant contributions of underwater exploration was the study of the Mediterranean's Aegean and Eastern regions, where evidence of catastrophic geological events aligned with the timeframes described for Bronze Age civilizations. Investigations around Santorini and Crete, for instance, revealed submerged settlements, volcanic deposits, and tsunami-related debris, corroborating the hypothesis that natural disasters could devastate advanced societies. While these discoveries do not directly confirm the existence of Atlantis, they provide tangible evidence of the types of events that could inspire narratives of sudden societal collapse, suggesting that Plato's account may have been rooted in memory of historical catastrophes amplified through oral tradition. Beyond the Mediterranean, exploratory surveys in the Atlantic Ocean examined continental shelf regions, sunken islands, and anomalous topographic features that could represent submerged landmasses. Mapping projects identified extensive coastal terraces and submerged plateaus along the Azores, Canary Islands, and Caribbean regions, prompting speculation about their potential connection to lost civilizations. These findings demonstrated that large areas of the ocean had undergone significant geological transformation over millennia, reinforcing the plausibility of submerged landforms and highlighting the dynamic interaction between tectonic forces, sea level changes, and human settlement patterns. Archaeologists also integrated submerged sites into broader reconstructions of ancient trade, communication, and cultural exchange networks. Sunken ports, quays, and harbor structures provided insights into maritime infrastructure, the movement of goods, and the organization of coastal economies. Comparative analysis with terrestrial archaeological sites illustrated the sophistication of Bronze Age societies, emphasizing their capacity for urban planning, technological innovation, and long-distance interaction. By documenting the material evidence of maritime activity and infrastructure, researchers could infer the scale, complexity, and societal organization of civilizations that had been partially or wholly submerged, reinforcing parallels with Plato's description of Atlantis. Environmental and geological studies complemented these underwater investigations. By analyzing sediment cores, coral growth patterns, and seismic activity, scientists reconstructed ancient coastlines, sea levels, and environmental conditions. These reconstructions revealed periods of rapid sea level rise, subsidence, and catastrophic flooding that would have dramatically altered coastal settlements. Such findings highlight the vulnerability of human communities to environmental change and demonstrate that the sudden disappearance of islands or settlements is not merely hypothetical. The integration of geological and archaeological data allows for a multidimensional understanding of how natural forces could erase visible evidence of advanced civilizations, creating narratives that could persist in cultural memory. Underwater discoveries also prompted reassessment of prior speculative claims about Atlantis, emphasizing empirical observation over conjecture. While enthusiasts continued to propose potential locations, the rigorous documentation of submerged sites and the analysis of associated artifacts provided a basis for separating plausible hypotheses from imaginative speculation. This approach reinforced the scientific credibility of underwater archaeology and established methodological standards for evaluating evidence of lost or submerged civilizations, bridging the gap between classical texts, historical interpretation, and material observation. The study of submerged landscapes further revealed the interplay between human adaptation and environmental stress. Analysis of coastal settlements, harbor engineering, and urban planning demonstrated that societies had developed strategies to cope with changing shorelines, floods, and maritime hazards. These adaptive measures underscore the resilience and ingenuity of ancient civilizations while highlighting their vulnerability to catastrophic events that exceeded their capacity for mitigation. In this context, Atlantis serves as a narrative emblem of the tension between human ambition, technological achievement, and environmental forces, illustrating enduring lessons about the relationship between society and nature. In conclusion, 20th century research on submerged landscapes and underwater archaeology provides critical context for understanding the potential historical foundations of Atlantis. Technological advances enabled the discovery and documentation of sunken settlements, harbor structures, and coastal transformations, demonstrating that environmental change can erase substantial evidence of human activity. Geological reconstructions corroborated these findings, offering insight into catastrophic events capable of inspiring narratives of sudden societal collapse. While no site has been definitively identified as Atlantis, the study of submerged landscapes validates the plausibility of lost civilizations, reinforces parallels with Bronze Age societies such as the Minoans, and establishes a rigorous, interdisciplinary framework for examining the interaction of human achievement, environmental vulnerability, and cultural memory. These discoveries provide a bridge to contemporary debates, ensuring that the study of Atlantis remains both a scientifically grounded inquiry and a culturally resonant exploration of human history, ambition, and resilience. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Atlantis evolved from a subject of scholarly inquiry to a cultural phenomenon, inspiring popular fascination, pseudoscientific speculation, and widespread media representation. The narrative of a lost, advanced civilization captured the imagination of writers, filmmakers, and theorists, who often emphasized mystery, esoteric knowledge, and catastrophic disappearance over historical accuracy. Popular culture transformed Atlantis into a symbol of human ambition, technological prowess, and the allure of hidden knowledge, reflecting both enduring fascination with lost civilizations and the human desire to explore the unknown. Pseudoscientific interpretations proliferated during this period, blending classical texts, speculative archaeology, and imaginative reconstruction. Authors such as Ignatius Donnelly, who initially wrote in the late 19th century, inspired a wave of enthusiasts in the 20th century who posited Atlantis as a center of lost technological knowledge or as a progenitor of later civilizations. These claims often lacked rigorous empirical evidence, but incorporated creative hypotheses about advanced engineering, extraterrestrial influence, or esoteric wisdom. While dismissed by mainstream scholarship, these narratives significantly shaped public perception, emphasizing the narrative's enduring cultural and symbolic power. Atlantis also became a prominent feature in literature, film, and visual media. Science fiction, adventure novels, and documentaries repeatedly referenced the Lost Island, often portraying it as technologically superior, morally instructive, or mystically significant. Popular works drew upon Plato's account while expanding its narrative scope, incorporating elements such as advanced energy systems, hidden continents, or connections to modern civilizations. These representations reinforced Atlantis as a versatile cultural motif, capable of conveying ethical, imaginative, and speculative themes simultaneously. The emergence of television, radio, and later digital media further amplified interest in Atlantis, reaching global audiences and inspiring interactive engagement. Documentaries, educational programs, and fictional adaptations introduced viewers to the narrative while highlighting archaeological discoveries, geological research, and historical interpretations. These presentations frequently juxtaposed scientific findings with speculative theories, illustrating the interplay between empirical research and imaginative storytelling. The result was a popular understanding of Atlantis as both a potentially real historical phenomenon and a cultural symbol of lost knowledge and vanished civilizations. Despite its prevalence in popular culture, rigorous scholarship continued to investigate Atlantis using evidence-based methods. Archaeologists, historians, and geologists engaged with classical texts, comparative studies, and underwater exploration to assess claims critically. Research emphasized the importance of contextualizing Plato's narrative within its literary, philosophical, and historical frameworks, distinguishing between allegorical instruction and empirical possibility. While definitive identification remained elusive, scholarly engagement ensured that Atlantis retained intellectual relevance alongside its cultural and imaginative prominence. Atlantis also became a focal point for interdisciplinary inquiry, drawing together fields such as archaeology, geology, mythology, and cultural studies. Scholars examined the narrative's origins, dissemination, and reception across different historical periods, tracing its influence on human thought, exploration, and storytelling. Comparative studies highlighted similarities between Atlantis and other legendary or historically documented civilizations, emphasizing patterns of societal development, environmental vulnerability, and moral instruction. This approach reinforced the narrative's dual function as both a literary construct and a conceptual tool for understanding human history. The interplay between speculation and evidence in the modern period underscores the narrative's adaptability and enduring appeal. While popular accounts often prioritize mystery and narrative embellishment, empirical research continues to illuminate plausible historical, environmental, and cultural contexts that could have inspired Plato's story. The persistent fascination with Atlantis demonstrates the human desire to reconcile imagination with knowledge, to explore hidden or lost aspects of the past, and to engage with narratives that combine moral instruction, technological speculation, and historical curiosity. In conclusion, modern speculation on Atlantis reflects the convergence of popular culture, pseudoscientific inquiry, and rigorous scholarship. The narrative has inspired imaginative reinterpretation while remaining a subject of empirical investigation, bridging literature, history, and science. Atlantis serves simultaneously as a symbol of lost human achievement, a cautionary tale about hubris and moral decline, and a platform for exploring environmental vulnerability, technological sophistication, and cultural memory. This dual character ensures that the story continues to captivate both general audiences and academic researchers, demonstrating the persistent relevance of Plato's account in contemporary discourse. By engaging with the narrative critically and creatively, modern scholars and enthusiasts alike contribute to an evolving understanding of the relationship between myth, history, and human ambition, reinforcing Atlantis as a lasting point of intersection between imagination, evidence, and ethical reflection. Contemporary Atlantis studies are defined by rigorous scientific critique, interdisciplinary methodology, and critical engagement with both historical sources and archaeological evidence. Scholars in archaeology, geology, oceanography, and classical studies approach Plato's narrative with a focus on empirical validation, methodological transparency, and contextual analysis. Unlike popular speculation, modern academic inquiry emphasizes evidence-based reasoning, the careful evaluation of sources, and the integration of environmental, cultural, and historical data to assess the plausibility of a lost civilization. This approach situates Atlantis within broader patterns of Bronze Age societal development, natural catastrophe, and narrative transmission. Textual analysis remains a cornerstone of contemporary studies. Researchers examine Plato's Timaeus and Critias in their original Greek, considering linguistic nuances, philosophical context, and intended didactic purposes. This scrutiny allows scholars to distinguish allegorical elements from potential references to historical events or places. Plato's account is evaluated alongside other classical sources, including Egyptian, Minoan, and Near Eastern records, to identify patterns of societal organization, technological achievement, and urban planning that might have inspired the narrative. Such analysis underscores the narrative's literary sophistication and its potential roots in historical memory rather than purely imaginative creation. Archaeological evidence is central to evaluating claims about Atlantis. Excavations of Bronze Age civilizations, particularly the Minoans, Mycenaeans, and coastal Mediterranean settlements, provide concrete examples of advanced urban planning, engineering, and governance. Researchers analyze palatial complexes, harbor infrastructure, and material culture to assess the technological capabilities described by Plato. While no site has been definitively identified as Atlantis, these studies demonstrate that civilizations with complex administration, maritime prowess, and societal stratification did exist during the time frame commonly associated with the narrative. Comparative analysis allows scholars to explore how oral traditions and historical events may have been transformed into literary allegory. Geological and environmental research further informs contemporary analysis. Studies of volcanic activity, seismic events, sea level fluctuations, and tsunamis provide plausible mechanisms for the sudden destruction of coastal or island settlements. The eruption of Thera, Santorini, remains a key case study, illustrating how catastrophic natural events could disrupt trade networks, depopulate regions, and inspire enduring narratives of societal collapse. Researchers employ sediment analysis, radiocarbon dating, and paleogeographic reconstruction to model ancient environments, emphasizing the interaction between human societies and environmental stressors. This multidisciplinary approach grounds Atlantis in a scientifically plausible framework while maintaining critical evaluation of historical sources. Underwater archaeology and oceanographic technology have expanded the capacity to investigate submerged landscapes. Sonar mapping, submersibles, and remotely operated vehicles enable systematic surveys of continental shelves, submerged settlements, and coastal terraces. Discoveries of sunken ports, quays, and structural remains provide insight into maritime organization and urban planning. While no submerged site has been conclusively linked to Atlantis, these studies demonstrate that large-scale environmental transformations can erase visible evidence of advanced societies, lending empirical weight to the plausibility of narratives describing vanished civilizations. Contemporary Atlantis studies also incorporate historiographical analysis, examining the evolution of the narrative across time and culture. Researchers trace interpretations from Plato through Hellenistic, Roman, medieval, Renaissance, and Enlightenment periods, considering how shifts in intellectual context, moral frameworks, and geographic knowledge shaped the story's reception. This meta-analysis highlights the interplay between text, context, and interpretation, demonstrating that Atlantis functions both as a historical inquiry and as a cultural artifact reflecting changing human priorities, curiosity, and moral reflection. A critical element of modern methodology is the distinction between empirical plausibility and imaginative elaboration. Scholars emphasize that while elements of the narrative may be inspired by historical events, no direct archaeological evidence confirms the existence of Atlantis as described by Plato. By applying rigorous standards of evidence, interdisciplinary analysis, and critical reasoning, contemporary researchers situate Atlantis within the realm of plausible historical analogues, such as Minoan Crete or other Bronze Age maritime societies, rather than asserting literal historicity. This approach balances curiosity with scientific rigor, preserving the narrative's instructive value while preventing unverified speculation from undermining scholarly credibility. In conclusion, scientific critique and historical methodology in contemporary Atlantis studies demonstrate the integration of classical scholarship, archaeology, geology, oceanography, and historiography. Researchers critically evaluate Plato's text, contextualize it within Bronze Age civilization, and analyze environmental and geological phenomena to construct a multidimensional understanding of the narrative. While definitive identification remains elusive, the application of empirical standards, interdisciplinary tools, and comparative analysis provides insight into the historical plausibility, cultural significance, and enduring fascination of Atlantis. This stage of research bridges classical literature, modern science, and cultural inquiry, ensuring that Atlantis continues to serve as both a symbol of human achievement and a subject of rational investigation, linking past speculation with contemporary evidence-based scholarship. Throughout human history, environmental catastrophes have shaped the rise and fall of civilizations, providing a crucial lens through which to examine the story of Atlantis. Natural disasters, ranging from volcanic eruptions and earthquakes to tsunamis and climate fluctuations, have repeatedly demonstrated the vulnerability of complex societies to sudden environmental shifts. By analyzing these events, historians, archaeologists, and geologists gain insight into the ways in which ecological forces influence societal resilience, technological adaptation, and the potential for rapid societal collapse. The narrative of Atlantis, with its depiction of a highly advanced society abruptly destroyed by natural forces, aligns conceptually with these patterns, illustrating how environmental vulnerability and human ambition intersect in historical experience. Archaeological evidence of catastrophic environmental events provides concrete parallels to the Atlantis narrative. The eruption of Thera, modern Santorini, around 1600 BCE, for example, devastated nearby Minoan settlements, generating tsunamis, volcanic ash deposition, and seismic disturbances that disrupted trade, agriculture, and urban life. Excavations reveal a sudden abandonment of affected areas, alongside preservation of infrastructure and artifacts, highlighting both the technological sophistication of these societies and their susceptibility to environmental shocks. Such events demonstrate that even highly organized, technologically capable civilizations can experience rapid decline when faced with catastrophic natural phenomena, a central theme echoed in Plato's account. Beyond singular catastrophes, long-term environmental processes played a role in shaping societal trajectories. Sea level rise, coastal erosion, and changes in river systems altered habitable landscapes, impacting settlement patterns, resource availability, and trade networks. In the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, shifts in climate and water availability influenced agricultural productivity and urban sustainability. Societies that adapted successfully developed engineering solutions, irrigation networks, and storage systems, while those unable to cope faced population decline or migration. The story of Atlantis can be viewed as a literary reflection of these dynamics, symbolizing the precarious balance between human innovation and environmental forces. Comparative studies reveal that multiple ancient civilizations experienced environmental crises leading to societal disruption. The collapse of the Akkadian Empire in Mesopotamia, partially attributed to prolonged droughts, illustrates the vulnerability of complex state systems to ecological stress. Similarly, the decline of the Maya civilization in Mesoamerica coincided with recurrent droughts and resource depletion. These historical examples underscore the plausibility of narratives describing the sudden fall of advanced societies due to environmental factors, providing context for interpreting Atlantis as a case study in the broader phenomenon of human-environment interaction. Geological and paleoenvironmental research offers additional insight into mechanisms of catastrophe. Studies of sediment cores, tsunami deposits, and coral reefs reconstruct the frequency and magnitude of past events, allowing scientists to model the impact of natural disasters on ancient populations. Such reconstructions indicate that coastal and island communities were especially vulnerable to rapid, high-impact events, supporting the conceptual framework in which Atlantis destruction could result from a combination of geological, climatic, and hydrological factors. These models integrate scientific data with historical and archaeological interpretation, bridging empirical evidence with literary accounts. The study of environmental catastrophe also illuminates societal responses to disaster. Evidence of urban planning, fortifications, early warning mechanisms, and adaptive infrastructure reflects the ingenuity of ancient communities in mitigating risk. In many cases, however, the scale or suddenness of events exceeded adaptive capacity, leading to abandonment, migration, or cultural transformation. The Atlantis narrative encapsulates this tension between human achievement and environmental vulnerability, serving as both a historical analog and a cautionary framework for understanding the fragility of complex societies in the face of natural forces. In conclusion, the exploration of environmental catastrophe provides a critical perspective for understanding the historical plausibility and thematic resonance of Atlantis. Archaeological, geological, and paleoenvironmental evidence demonstrates that advanced societies are subject to rapid decline when confronted with natural disasters, while also illustrating the capacity for human adaptation and resilience. Plato's narrative can thus be interpreted as a reflection of these dynamics, embedding lessons about the consequences of ecological disruption, the limits of technological control, and the intersection of human ambition with environmental constraint. By situating Atlantis within the broader context of environmental history, researchers and audiences alike gain insight into the vulnerabilities and achievements of past civilizations, bridging literary narrative, empirical investigation, and historical reflection in a comprehensive understanding of human-environment interaction. Human agency plays a central role in understanding the collapse of complex societies, complementing the influence of environmental forces in historical analysis. While natural disasters and ecological shifts create conditions for societal stress, the decisions of political leaders, economic systems, and social institutions determine how communities respond to crises. In the context of Atlantis, Plato emphasizes both the technological and moral dimensions of societal collapse. The island's advanced engineering, military organization, and urban planning are counterbalanced by hubris, moral decay, and administrative overreach. Contemporary studies of historical civilizations similarly illustrate that environmental shocks alone rarely precipitate collapse. Instead, human choices, institutional structures, and societal resilience mediate outcomes. Historical case studies provide insight into the interaction between human agency and environmental stress. The Late Bronze Age collapse, for example, affected multiple civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean, including the Mycenaeans, Hittites, and Minoans. Evidence suggests that drought, seismic activity, and trade disruption contributed to systemic stress, but internal factors, such as political fragmentation, administrative inefficiency, and social unrest, played decisive roles in amplifying vulnerability. Societies that adapted through flexible governance, resource redistribution, and technological innovation were more likely to survive, whereas rigid hierarchies or elite mismanagement accelerated decline. These patterns resonate with Plato's narrative, where Atlantis' downfall is attributed not solely to natural forces, but to ethical and administrative failings. The concept of hubris in human decision-making is particularly relevant to the study of societal collapse. Leaders' overreach, exploitation of resources, and disregard for social cohesion often exacerbate vulnerabilities exposed by environmental change. Archaeological evidence, such as the overexpansion of urban centers, unsustainable agricultural practices, and reliance on fragile trade networks, demonstrates that advanced societies may inadvertently create conditions for their own decline. Atlantis can thus be interpreted as an illustrative example of the interplay between human ambition, technological capacity, and the limitations imposed by ecological and social realities. Economic and infrastructural factors also highlight the role of human agency. Societies dependent on centralized authority, long-distance trade, or specialized labor systems are particularly susceptible to disruption when administrative or environmental shocks occur. In the Bronze Age Mediterranean, the collapse of trade networks following the eruption of Thera or other regional disturbances illustrates how external pressures can interact with internal vulnerabilities. The loss of food security, disruption of resource distribution, and breakdown of political authority often precipitate rapid social change or abandonment of settlements. Plato's account reflects this dynamic, portraying a society whose organizational sophistication is undermined by overextension and ethical failings. Cultural and social responses further shape outcomes in times of crisis. Evidence from collapsed civilizations indicates that communities employ adaptive strategies such as migration, technological innovation, or social reorganization to mitigate disaster. However, these responses are mediated by societal norms, governance structures, and moral frameworks. In the narrative of Atlantis, the failure of moral and civic virtue undermines collective resilience, reinforcing the notion that ethical conduct and societal cohesion are integral to survival. This intersection of morality, governance, and environmental stress provides a conceptual bridge between historical observation and Platonic philosophy. Modern research integrates quantitative modeling and simulation to examine how human agency influences societal collapse. Scholars employ demographic analysis, resource management studies, and network modeling to assess the vulnerability of complex systems to environmental and social perturbations. These approaches confirm that societies with rigid hierarchies, inequitable resource distribution, or centralized dependency are disproportionately affected by stressors, while adaptive, decentralized systems exhibit greater resilience. The narrative of Atlantis exemplifies this principle conceptually, illustrating how the combination of human mismanagement and external forces can produce catastrophic outcomes, even in technologically advanced communities. In conclusion, the study of human agency emphasizes that societal collapse is not solely the product of environmental catastrophe, but results from the interaction between natural forces and human decisions. Plato's depiction of Atlantis highlights the duality of technological sophistication and moral responsibility, illustrating how ethical, political, and administrative failures amplify vulnerability to external stressors. Historical parallels, including the late Bronze Age collapse and other ancient societal declines, reinforce the plausibility of such dynamics. By analyzing human agency alongside environmental factors, contemporary research provides a comprehensive framework for understanding the complex mechanisms of societal resilience, adaptation, and collapse. This perspective situates Atlantis as both a literary allegory and a conceptual model, bridging historical evidence, philosophical reflection, and the enduring relevance of human choices in shaping the trajectory of civilizations. The narrative of Atlantis has exerted a profound and enduring influence on philosophy, literature, and culture, shaping human thought across millennia. Plato's dialogues, written in the 4th century BCE, introduced the story as both a historical allegory and a philosophical reflection on the nature of human society, ethics, and governance. Over time, Atlantis became a conceptual touchstone, inspiring philosophical debates about ideal societies, moral responsibility, and the consequences of hubris. Its continued resonance demonstrates the capacity of mythic narratives to inform ethical discourse, cultural imagination, and intellectual inquiry, bridging antiquity and the modern world. In philosophical traditions, Atlantis has frequently been invoked as a lens through which to examine the dynamics of civilization. Classical and later thinkers analyzed the narrative as a reflection on the rise and fall of societies, exploring themes of justice, governance, and moral virtue. Renaissance humanists interpreted Atlantis as an illustration of the consequences of civic corruption and the importance of ethical leadership. Enlightenment philosophers emphasized reason and empirical observation, treating the story as a cautionary example of societal overreach and environmental vulnerability. Across these periods, the narrative functioned as both a moral allegory and a conceptual framework for evaluating human achievement and failure. Literature has played a central role in transmitting and transforming the story of Atlantis. From classical references in Roman texts to Renaissance and Enlightenment treatises, authors have reimagined the island's narrative to reflect contemporary concerns about governance, technological progress, and societal decline. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Atlantis inspired both scholarly writing and popular fiction, ranging from historical speculation to adventure novels and science fiction. These literary treatments often emphasized advanced technology, lost knowledge, or mystical wisdom, reinforcing the narrative's symbolic flexibility while engaging audiences with questions of human ambition, ethical responsibility, and the fragility of civilization. Cultural expressions of Atlantis extend beyond literature to visual art, film, and media. Depictions of the lost island appear in paintings, cinematic adaptations, documentaries, and digital media, each interpreting the narrative through the lens of contemporary imagination. These portrayals frequently emphasize Atlantis as a technologically sophisticated society or as a cautionary emblem of moral and environmental hubris. While artistic representations may diverge from historical or archaeological evidence, they reflect the enduring symbolic power of the narrative and its capacity to stimulate inquiry into societal organization, technological innovation, and the ethical dimensions of human activity. In addition to artistic and literary influence, Atlantis has inspired philosophical and scientific reflection on human achievement and vulnerability. Scholars have examined the interplay between technological development, environmental management, and ethical governance, using the narrative as a conceptual tool for exploring societal resilience and collapse. Comparative studies with Bronze Age civilizations, such as the Minoans and Mycenaeans, provide empirical grounding for discussions of organizational sophistication, urban planning, and maritime trade. By linking mythic narrative to historical and archaeological evidence, the story of Atlantis offers a framework for interdisciplinary inquiry, integrating philosophy, history, and the natural sciences. The story of Atlantis has also influenced modern discussions of environmental and societal sustainability. Plato's account underscores the consequences of overextension, resource mismanagement, and moral decline, themes that resonate in contemporary debates about climate change, urbanization, and ecological stewardship. By framing societal collapse as the result of both human and natural factors, the narrative provides enduring lessons about the necessity of ethical governance, adaptive planning, and collective responsibility. The story's continued relevance reflects the intersection of historical inquiry, philosophical reflection, and contemporary societal concerns. In conclusion, the enduring legacy of Atlantis in philosophy and culture demonstrates the narrative's multifaceted significance. It has functioned as an ethical allegory, a historical hypothesis, and a source of imaginative inspiration, shaping human thought across literature, art, and scholarly discourse. The narrative's themes, hubris, technological achievement, environmental vulnerability, and moral responsibility, remain relevant to both historical and contemporary audiences. By bridging classical philosophy, empirical investigation, and cultural imagination, Atlantis continues to serve as a symbol of human potential and vulnerability, illustrating the complex interplay between ethical conduct, societal organization, and environmental forces. Its influence persists in academic scholarship, artistic expression, and popular culture, ensuring that the story of Atlantis remains a vital point of reflection on the trajectory of civilizations, both past and present. The story of Atlantis has long served as a model for ethical and political reflection, illustrating the interplay between governance, morality, and societal sustainability. Plato's account emphasizes that the island's technological sophistication and centralized administration were undermined by moral decline, excessive ambition, and neglect of civic virtue. This narrative has informed philosophical, political, and educational discourse, demonstrating that the stability and longevity of complex societies depend not only on technological or economic capability, but also on ethical leadership, social cohesion, and accountability. Atlantis thereby functions as both a cautionary tale and a conceptual framework for understanding the dynamics of power and responsibility. In classical philosophy, Atlantis exemplifies the consequences of hubris and misgovernance. Plato's dialogue suggests that the island's rulers, initially virtuous and organized, gradually succumbed to arrogance and ethical decay, ultimately precipitating societal collapse. Scholars have interpreted this trajectory as a model for analyzing political systems, emphasizing the relationship between moral conduct, law, and civic stability. The narrative provides a lens for examining the tension between power and accountability, illustrating that even technologically advanced societies can fail if ethical considerations are neglected. During the Renaissance and Enlightenment, philosophers and political theorists drew on the Atlantis narrative to explore ideal governance and the dangers of overreach. Humanists emphasized the role of virtue in sustaining social order, while Enlightenment thinkers incorporated empirical reasoning to analyze historical precedents and natural limitations. Atlantis became a reference point for discussions of institutional design, resource management, and the societal impact of leadership failures. By situating the narrative within broader philosophical discourse, scholars linked moral and political reflection with practical considerations of sustainability and resilience. Atlantis also functions as a paradigm for ethical education. The narrative illustrates that technological capability, military power, or wealth alone cannot guarantee societal longevity. Moral and civic responsibility are equally essential. Educators, philosophers, and writers have used the story to prompt reflection on contemporary governance, highlighting the importance of ethical decision-making, social accountability, and the management of communal resources. The enduring relevance of Atlantis in this context demonstrates its utility as a tool for ethical reasoning and civic instruction across cultural and temporal boundaries. Comparative analysis reinforces the narrative's applicability to real-world governance. Historical examples, such as the late Bronze Age collapse in the Eastern Mediterranean or the fall of Minoan and Mycenaean societies, illustrate how environmental pressures, resource mismanagement, and internal political weaknesses combine to precipitate societal decline. These cases echo the dynamics described in Plato's account, providing empirical grounding for the philosophical lessons embedded in the narrative. By connecting mythic allegory with historical evidence, scholars highlight how Atlantis continues to inform contemporary understanding of governance, ethical responsibility, and societal resilience. Modern discourse on political philosophy and sustainability frequently invokes Atlantis as a conceptual model. Debates on urban planning, resource distribution, environmental stewardship, and societal vulnerability often draw upon the narrative's lessons, emphasizing the integration of technological, administrative, and ethical considerations. Atlantis exemplifies how a society's moral and political framework interacts with environmental and structural challenges, providing insight into the factors that contribute to either societal longevity or collapse. In conclusion, Atlantis operates as a model for ethical and political reflection, linking moral conduct, governance structures, and societal resilience. Plato's narrative demonstrates that even advanced societies are vulnerable to collapse when ethical principles and civic responsibility are neglected, offering lessons that remain pertinent to historical and contemporary contexts. By bridging philosophy, political theory, and historical analysis, the story of Atlantis illustrates the complex interdependence of morality, governance, and human achievement. This conceptual framework ensures that Atlantis continues to serve as a reference point for scholars, educators, and policymakers, providing enduring insight into the ethical and political dimensions of civilization and reinforcing its role as a narrative that informs both intellectual inquiry and practical reflection on human societies. In the contemporary era, Atlantis occupies a unique position at the intersection of scientific inquiry, popular culture, and cultural imagination. The narrative continues to inspire fascination, bridging historical investigation, archaeological research, and imaginative exploration. Modern scientists, historians, and archaeologists engage with Plato's account critically, examining the plausibility of a lost civilization while contextualizing it within Bronze Age history, natural disasters, and human societal development. Simultaneously, popular culture sustains the narrative's allure, presenting Atlantis in films, literature, documentaries, and digital media as a symbol of lost knowledge, advanced technology, and the moral consequences of societal hubris. Scientific approaches to Atlantis today integrate interdisciplinary methods, drawing from archaeology, geology, oceanography, and paleoclimatology. Underwater surveys, sonar mapping, and submersible explorations provide empirical data on submerged landscapes, coastal erosion, and tectonic shifts, revealing evidence of sunken settlements and altered coastlines. Studies of volcanic eruptions, such as Thera, and other geological events offer plausible explanations for the sudden disappearance of communities, aligning with environmental catastrophes described in historical analogs. By combining fieldwork, laboratory analysis, and modeling, Contemporary science examines the potential historical underpinnings of Atlantis while maintaining critical rigor. Archaeological parallels further enrich contemporary understanding. Excavations of Minoan Crete, Mycenaean Cinners, and other Bronze Age civilizations provide concrete examples of urban planning, maritime trade, and technological sophistication that correspond to elements of Plato's account. While no site has been definitively identified as Atlantis, these findings illustrate that advanced societies existed in the ancient Mediterranean, demonstrating that the narrative may reflect historical memory of flourishing civilizations affected by environmental or social crises. Comparative analysis also highlights patterns of societal organization, governance, and resilience, offering insights into the mechanisms that sustain or undermine complex communities. Popular culture has amplified and transformed the narrative of Atlantis, blending historical speculation with imaginative reinterpretation. Films, novels, video games, and documentaries often emphasize advanced technology, hidden civilizations, or mystical wisdom, reinforcing the story's symbolic resonance. This interplay between science and imagination demonstrates how Atlantis functions as both a subject of empirical investigation and a cultural touchstone, capable of engaging diverse audiences across educational, entertainment, and philosophical contexts. Such representations, while not empirically grounded, sustain the narrative's visibility and invite broader reflection on human achievement, societal vulnerability, and the ethical dimensions of progress. Contemporary scholarship also examines the narrative's role in cultural memory and myth-making. Atlantis exemplifies how stories can persist across millennia, integrating moral, ethical, and historical elements into enduring cultural frameworks. Researchers analyze the dissemination and adaptation of the narrative across time, exploring how it has influenced philosophy, literature, environmental awareness, and social reflection. This cultural perspective underscores the dual nature of Atlantis as both a historically informed hypothesis and a symbolic construct, illustrating its continued relevance in human intellectual and imaginative life. Technological advancements have expanded opportunities for empirical exploration, with satellite imagery, remote sensing, and digital modeling providing new insights into submerged landscapes and ancient settlement patterns. These tools allow researchers to reconstruct paleogeography, assess the impact of sea level changes, and explore submerged features without intrusive excavation. By integrating these methods with archaeological and historical evidence, contemporary studies situate Atlantis within a scientifically plausible framework while maintaining critical engagement with the narrative's allegorical dimensions. In conclusion, Atlantis in contemporary scientific and cultural imagination embodies the convergence of evidence-based research and human curiosity. Archaeology, geology, oceanography, and paleoclimatology provide empirical foundations for evaluating the plausibility of lost civilizations, while popular culture, literature, and media sustain the narrative's symbolic and imaginative power. The story continues to inspire reflection on technological achievement, societal resilience, ethical governance, and environmental vulnerability. By bridging empirical investigation with cultural imagination, contemporary perspectives on Atlantis highlight the enduring relevance of Plato's narrative, demonstrating how historical inquiry, scientific exploration, and human creativity collectively shape our understanding of lost civilizations and the lessons they offer for both past and present societies. The story of Atlantis continues to serve as a powerful symbol for reflecting on human achievement, societal vulnerability, and the relationship between civilization and the natural environment. Plato's account presents a civilization that reached remarkable technological, administrative, and cultural heights, yet ultimately succumbed to both environmental catastrophe and internal moral decay. Contemporary analysis interprets this duality as a lens through which to examine the dynamics of societal success and failure, highlighting how innovation, governance, and ethical responsibility intersect with natural and social constraints to determine a civilization's trajectory. Historical parallels underscore the enduring relevance of these lessons. Advanced societies such as the Minoans, Mycenaeans, and various coastal Bronze Age communities demonstrate that technological sophistication and urban development do not guarantee resilience in the face of environmental stress or internal mismanagement. Archaeological evidence from these societies, including the abrupt abandonment of settlements, disruptions in trade networks, and structural damage from natural disasters, illustrates how complex systems can be destabilized when human planning and environmental conditions are misaligned. Atlantis, in this context, functions as a narrative encapsulation of these recurring patterns, emphasizing both the potential and the fragility inherent in human civilization. The symbolic significance of Atlantis extends beyond historical analogy to contemporary concerns about sustainability, ethical governance, and environmental stewardship. In modern discourse, the narrative is frequently invoked to explore the consequences of overexploitation, social inequity, and technological hubris. Urbanization, climate change, and resource mismanagement exemplify the challenges that mirror those faced by ancient civilizations, highlighting the need for strategic planning, adaptive capacity, and ethical decision-making. Atlantis, therefore, functions as both a historical cautionary tale and a conceptual framework for evaluating present and future societal choices. Educational and cultural interpretations of Atlantis emphasize the importance of moral and civic responsibility in sustaining societal achievement. By portraying the collapse of a highly advanced civilization as the result of ethical decline, the narrative reinforces the principle that technological capability alone is insufficient for long-term survival. This insight informs educational curricula, public discourse, and philosophical reflection, providing a template for exploring the interdependence of morality, governance, and environmental management. The story's allegorical power encourages critical engagement with questions of human ambition, societal priorities, and the consequences of neglecting ethical principles in the exercise of power. Atlantis also serves as a model for interdisciplinary inquiry, bridging the natural sciences, social sciences, and humanities. Archaeology, geology, and paleoclimatology provide empirical frameworks for understanding environmental vulnerability and societal adaptation, while history, philosophy, and literature illuminate ethical, cultural, and organizational dimensions. By integrating these perspectives, the narrative fosters a holistic understanding of civilization, highlighting both its creative potential and its susceptibility to failure. This interdisciplinary approach ensures that Atlantis remains relevant as a subject of study, connecting empirical investigation with ethical reflection and cultural imagination. In conclusion, Atlantis endures as a symbol of human achievement and vulnerability, illustrating the complex interplay between technological innovation, ethical governance, and environmental forces. Plato's narrative encapsulates lessons that remain pertinent across historical, cultural, and scientific domains, emphasizing that the success of a civilization depends not solely on material sophistication, but on moral integrity, adaptive capacity, and social cohesion. By examining Atlantis through both empirical and symbolic lenses, contemporary research and cultural reflection illuminate the conditions under which societies thrive or collapse, providing enduring insight into human potential, responsibility, and resilience. The story thus continues to inspire thoughtful analysis, bridging historical inquiry, scientific exploration, and ethical reflection in a comprehensive understanding of civilization's possibilities and limitations.